The US civil rights movement emerged in the early 1950s as a fight for desegregation of the southern states and a push for equality between black and white citizens. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. is thought of as the father of the civil rights movement. It was his influence that fostered the movement in becoming one of the most successful movements where non-violent resistance led to social change. The founders of the movement adhered not to a vague rejection of violence, but Satyagraha, a well-defined political and social philosophy. King has given credit to Gandhi for inspiration. Gandhi's theory of Satyagraha provided a basis for gaining freedom and justice via non-violent methods. King stated that the guardian method of non-violence is one of the most potent weapons available to an oppressed people in their struggle for freedom.
Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children.
Developed by Mohandas Gandhi, Satyagraha was first exercised as a political tactic during the revolution against the South African apartheid in 1906. Satyagraha is literally translated into truth force or soul force. On an individual level, Satyagraha theory emphasizes the search for truth by understanding all sides of a conflict. On a larger societal level, Satyagraha emphasizes non-violent action and civil disobedience to confront unjust laws and bring about social change. There are four main principles of Satyagraha which were reflected in the American civil rights movement: the insistence of equality, self-suffering, non-violent resistance, and civil disobedience.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
The notion of equality is essential to the practices of Satyagraha. Satyagraha is based on actions to rid injustice for all people. Therefore, it is inherently against any form of discrimination. As Dwyer argues, a Satyagrahi subscribes completely to this view of unity. There is no other in the world. Martin Luther King reflects this truth in his speech, stating that all men are created equal.
Soul force, the marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community, must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny.
King urges his followers not to distrust all white people, as many of our white brothers have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with ours. By referring to white people as his brothers, King reiterates the goal of equality. This is hugely important to the success of the civil rights movement. The injustice being opposed is racial discrimination. It needs to be addressed with a push for equality in partner with the opponents. As such, using the term brother breaks down any us versus them mindsets. Satyagraha uses self-suffering as a way to secure reforms. Suffering against violent acts also works to help the opponent understand the injustice. When a violent act is met with violent retaliation, the violence is justified. When a violent act is met by peace and suffering, the perpetrator is forced to reconsider their act of violence and the place of the victim. Gandhi and King both understood that suffering by activists had the mysterious power of converting opponents who would otherwise refuse to listen.
Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution. and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive.
King shared the Satyagraha belief that suffering has tremendous educational and transforming possibilities. He stated that unearned suffering was redemptive, as they would be rewarded with the truth of the injustice behind the racial discrimination being exposed. Gandhi describes patience as a form of self-suffering. This refers to the patience in resisting violent retaliation and helping your opponent understand the truth of the injustice through nonviolent acts or soul force. The notion of self-suffering is directly linked with nonviolent action. King was vocal about his vision of a nonviolent movement in 2 points. Firstly, that the battle is against forces of evil and not individuals. And secondly, that nonviolence requires the willingness to suffer. Using soul force or nonviolent resistance against a violent opponent can mean both physical and psychological suffering.
In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force.
Nonviolent resistance also works in surprising the attacker into a transformation of their mind. Inflicting violence without any retaliation can develop a sense of shame in the attacker, thereby forcing the attacker to take a step back and redress the situation. Civil disobedience is the Satyagraha technique of non-violently refusing to cooperate with injustice. Gandhi was jailed many times for civil disobedience. At one trial, he argued that in his opinion, non-cooperation with evil is as much a duty as is cooperation with good. North Carolina in 1960 saw the first major civil disobedience act by activists of the civil rights movement. 4 African American men sat at a Woolworths lunch counter, which was segregated for whites only.
And staring and looking as though they were fixed in time.
McCain expected to be cracked over the head, hauled off to jail, or both. And sure enough, a police officer soon appeared.
And he started to pace the counter back and forth, and as he walked back and forth, he started to pound his nightstick in his hand. But after he paced 3 times with his nightstick, I said to myself, we've got him. He really doesn't know what to do. And you ask yourself, I did quite often, what was all the fuss about? What was all the mistreatment about? I mean, what was this thing that people are so afraid of?
As Gandhi argued in 1920, there come occasions when you consider certain laws to be so unjust that it could be considered disgraceful to obey them. You then openly and civilly break them and quietly suffer the penalty for their breach. The 4 men involved in the Greensboro sit-ins broke a law they considered immoral and unjust in a non-violent fashion. Their refusal to cooperate with the injustice reflects the theory of Satyagraha. The men suffered the consequences of their actions in forms of ridicule, bullying, and violence, with the hope of getting their opponents to see the truth of injustice in racial discrimination. The civil rights movement utilized various Satyagraha principles to achieve truth and justice. The movement was based upon the deeply rooted beliefs of equality, the inherent goodness of man allowing nonviolent resistance to be a successful mode for transformation, and how the patience and self-suffering can be a means of political and social change through tactics of civil disobedience and nonviolent protests.